Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight, for coming out in the, potential hurricane. I'm Erin. I am programming librarian here. I'm so glad you came to join us. To join Will Siss, who is the beer snob and has a fantastic new book out called Connecticut Beer. And we also are very happy to welcome the brewers behind Charter Oak Brewing, which is a New Canaan establishment, and they're going to do some tastings at the end of Will's talk. So thank you all for being here and for supporting programs at New Canaan Library. And if you like this kind of programs, I hope you'll vote with a couple dollars in our donation box at the back of the room and let us know that this is the kind of thing you want, because that's where I will put that money. I'm going to be a good steward of your donation, trust me. We also have a lineup of our October programs in the back. Feel free to take one and to add that to your calendar. Lots of cool things coming up here at the library. Very happy to welcome Will Siss, and I'm going to cede the stage to him.
Thank you, Erin. I want to thank the New Canaan Library. I want to thank Scott with Charter Oak Brewing. I want to thank Elm Street Books, which will be selling my book this evening. And I want to thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Will, and I have a wonderful opportunity, and I had a wonderful time writing this book. I wrote a book called Connecticut Beer, and today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the history of Connecticut beer. And in a lot of ways, the history of Connecticut beer is a history of Connecticut. It's a story of immigration. It's a story of invention and reinvention. It's a story about business. And it's really a story about ingenuity and creativity. And I am very lucky to have had a chance to spend a year and a half working on the book. And now I have had the awesome opportunity this summer and into the fall promoting it. So thanks again. My story begins as a young child. I'm the one who's small in this picture. This is from 1974. My dearly departed grandfather serving me some beer. And now he's a pediatrician, so apparently this was okay. A German-American family raised on Budweiser, for sure. And so for me, growing up, Bud was beer, and beer was what adults drank. And so as I went on to college and learned how to use alcohol and abuse alcohol and figure out what it did to me and what it didn't do, I learned a real love for it. But it wasn't until years later that I really had a much more refined palate and decided that it's not just something to drink. It's not something just to give you a good buzz. It's something that's part of our cultural heritage, and it really does have an amazing history to it. I was working at the Republican American newspaper that's in Waterbury, and I was covering the Naugatuck Valley. I was covering a lot of car accidents, and I was covering a lot of court cases. I was covering a lot of Board of Education meetings and planning and zoning meetings. And I was bored to tears. I've been trained as a journalist, and I loved talking to people, and I loved talking to strangers. And I really loved talking to strangers over a beer. And so I decided, when I'd had just enough of local politics and local crime, that I wanted to get into the high-stakes, wild world of public school education. So I became a middle school teacher. And I knew that I had had plenty of practice dealing with preteens because I had interviewed tons of politicians. So there really wasn't going to be much of a difference. But I didn't want to leave writing behind. I felt that it was important that I would keep going. And so I pitched this story idea. I said, how about I write a column about beer? And this was 2004, 2005, and there were about 6 or 7 breweries in the state. My editor thought, as soon as you profile all these breweries, as soon as you explain what a few styles are, maybe do a profile of a few bartenders. I don't know how much more you're going to have. And I agree. I don't know. I was happy to ride it out for a couple of months while I transitioned to becoming a teacher. Well, that was 11 years ago, and I still have the column going. It's called Beer Snob. I came up with that title as something that was sarcastic. There weren't a lot of beer snobs at the time. I thought there were only wine snobs. And over time, I've certainly found that there are plenty of beer snobs, and I guess I am one too. A little while ago, the history press out of South Carolina came to me, and they said, we see that you are a blogger. We see that you're a columnist. Would you write a whole book? I said, heck yeah. So they gave me a year and a half to write it, and that is on some nice stacks in the back of the room. I hope you consider getting one yourself. I'll start off with this quote. This came from some writers who came before me in the early 90s. I think it encapsulates a lot about Connecticut history. Over the centuries, it has continued to be made, despite shortages of ingredients, competition from other products, fervent social opposition, legal restrictions, and recently changing attitudes towards alcohol use. And that really is what Connecticut beer history is about. It's about clashes of culture. It's about the cities and the people who love their beer. And it's about the rural areas where people were often suspicious of alcohol. And it's about boom and bust. Up into the early 90s, we'll find that there was a big surge in this concept of a brew pub. And some of them are not with us anymore, and we'll talk about that. But let's go back into colonial history. Connecticut, of course, comes from an English tradition in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And New Haven, if anywhere, is the center of all of this. Stephen Goodyear was named the brewer of the city, the official brewer. Now, he was a smart guy because he was also a politician. And he knew that the one that you were going to be getting your beer from was also a person that you could trust. Right? And beer was not certainly something that you would go out and get at any bar kind of thing. Beer was a necessity. In a lot of ways, it helped shape the nation. There are many that say that the Mayflower pulled over in Massachusetts a little earlier than planned because they had run out of beer. And so Connecticut kept this tradition going. With an English tradition, there was a love of ale. Now, beer is brought into two categories, as many of you guys know. There's ales and there's lagers. Lagers ferment at a slightly warmer temperature, in some ways easier to make, and that was what people drank. And so what separates Connecticut a little bit from other states in New England is that we have really held on to that connection to ale, whereas many moved to lagers as well. It was in a way safer to drink because you were dealing with lots of bacteria with the water. By boiling the water to make beer, you had a safer product. A lot of the beer was made at home, and a lot of the beer was made by wives, and who were called the alewives. And this was a tradition from Europe as well. But after a while, just as the country was starting to settle, or even just before it was going to settle, taverns became very important to our nation's history. Because taverns were not just a place to get a drink. Taverns were also a place to meet, to come up with plans, to have a meeting of the militia. And that's what happened. The General Wolfe, for example, was run by a man named Isaiah Putnam, who was a military man during the Revolutionary War. And he had a wonderful spot in Brooklyn because it was between it was between Boston and New York, and it was an important thoroughfare. The Griswold Inn in beautiful Essex, Connecticut, stands today. And like Fuller's Tavern, George Washington drank there, although I think he drank a lot and slept around a lot too, so he's a very busy guy. And so they can make that claim. But they were very important to our history. With the 1800s come refrigeration and come the Germans. And the Germans that came into Connecticut played an important role because just like the English brought their love of ale, love of porter, the Germans brought their love of lager. Now, lager is a German word. It means to store. And so what they were able to bring along with refrigeration at the time was a beer that was crisper and cleaner and clearer. See, lagers became particularly important when glass was available more often. And so you could look at that beer and you could see it sparkle. It was in the cities that breweries made their mark early on. In New Haven especially, but also Hartford and Bridgeport and Waterbury. And in the book, what I try to do is take you through what a lot of those breweries were like. And I think one thing that was for sure is that they changed hands quite a bit. Because then, as in now, running a brewery is not an easy thing. You are talking about a very fragile product, and you're talking about sometimes a very fickle audience. And so I've grown in my respect, as I'm sure you will as well, in the people who run and own breweries. This is a tricky job. What I do in the book is I try and give a little snapshots of what some of these breweries were like. For example, Weibel's in New Haven, which started way back in 1851, actually did survive Prohibition. At the time of Prohibition, which started in 1920, there were 30 breweries in New Haven. How many breweries are in New Haven now? Can anyone tell me? Can anyone guess?
0.
Close.
3.
1. All right. But it's the feisty brew room at bar that does continue to make beer. And we're going to talk about the owner of that place, Jeff Browning, at the end. Hellman's started out as Kippen Hellman's in Waterbury. And they changed hands several times. Eventually they became Lauragay. They made a beer called the Red Fox beer. And they lasted all the way to 1947. The Eckert brothers, they established a brewery in Bridgeport. They were able to inherit their brewery from their father. They lasted until 1920, that sorrowful year, which began Prohibition. And Cremo of New Britain, 1905, they tried to bring in something new to the market, their health beer. I guess the idea was that at slightly lower alcohol, you were able to feed it to the kids. Now, that was not their plan, but there certainly is an element of marketing there. I think that rolls all the way through until today. They lasted until 1955. All right, we're going to go to church now. Brothers and sisters, said the Reverend Lyman Beecher, intemperance is the sin of our land, and with our boundless prosperity is coming in upon us like a flood. And if anything shall defeat the hopes of the world which hang upon our experiment in civil liberty, it is the river of fire, brothers and sisters, which is rolling through the land, destroying the vital air, and extending around an atmosphere of death. Now, he was not fooling around. This came from one of his 6 sermons on intemperance. And they were long sermons. This is one of the good quotes, though. And he was a preacher in Litchfield from 1810 to 1826 when he made a real impact. He wasn't just drumming up sinners. All right. He had a real point. There was a problem with alcohol in Connecticut and all over the country that would really come to a head in the early part of the 20th century, but he was one of those early adopters. And he knew that alcohol, when abused, especially hard alcohol, was ruining families, and it was making life very difficult, especially when people were too drunk to work. That was no small thing. Families were being impacted. So here we have the rumblings, the earliest part of intemperance. Now, there's a difference between temperance and prohibition. Temperance means ease up, you don't have to drink so much. And prohibition is don't drink at all. So we're going to see that these these voices have a real important role in Connecticut beer history. So Maine was really good. Maine was better at Connecticut than at getting the whole concept across of don't drink so much. All right? And Connecticut did what they did was they tried a statewide ban in 1854. It didn't go so well, mostly because it was not enforced particularly well. And so they tried something else. They tried what was called the local option law in 1872. This allowed different towns to vote as to whether they were going to be a dry town or a wet town, or a damp town, I guess, if they only have a few places to drink. Now, this also was not particularly well enforced. And when it came around to talk about a national prohibition, I mean an amendment to the United States Constitution, holy moly, Connecticut was not a fan, nor was Rhode Island. Okay, they both spoke out against it within their state legislatures, and they were doing the people's bidding. A lot of the people during this time, especially in the urban areas, especially with people who are recent immigrants, where drinking wine and drinking beer and drinking spirits are simply part of their cultural heritage. They did not want to be told what to do by their local government, and certainly not by their federal government. But they had to comply. So from 1920 to 1933, there was a national prohibition, a dark time for sure. And this hurt breweries a lot. Here are breweries that, had created the infrastructure to deliver this product that was now illegal. So what are you going to do? Some of them turned to making soda. Some of them turned to making 2.5% alcohol beer, near beer, cereal beer. Didn't sell, didn't do well. And so, unfortunately, Prohibition knocked a lot of breweries out. And what I found was that everybody, it seemed, was happy when Prohibition was over. Now that, of course, is an overstatement. But one of the statistics that I found that I thought was very interesting was about how crime, particularly in Bridgeport, where I was reading about, spiked almost every year over the time of Prohibition when it came to public intoxication. How can there be public intoxication when we've solved the alcohol problem, right? Obviously, people were getting it somewhere. Beer played a role in this as well. As Scott, the owner of Charter Oak, will tell you, people get creative, and they start making their own beer. They start making their own alcohol, and the idea was that they were going to do the best they could with what they could make. It wasn't enough, and people were very happy when this ban was lifted. They had millions of gallons ready to go. Now, it was slow to recover. They were slow to recover, and Hull's plays an important role in Connecticut brewing. Has anyone ever had any Hull's beer? They only closed in 1977, right? And in the history of Connecticut, it really wasn't that long ago. But they played an important role because they kept that tradition going, that local tradition going. It started by a colonel and changed hands several times. It was sad towards the end. They were kind of trying to get by and making sodas and malt liquor, but ultimately they could not survive. And we enter into a very dark period. During the 50s and 60s, it became harder and harder to get local beer. The giants of the industry, Budweiser, Schlitz, for example, were really muscling everyone out. Now, I don't go into tremendous detail about this, but from the anecdotes that I've heard, it really was kind of a war. And when you have the money, you usually win the war. So we enter this dark, quiet period, and there is one ray of light, and this is in 1978, when President Carter signed H.R. 1337. Now, say what you want about our former president. The idea is that he did something real smart here. The 21st Amendment, when that repealed the 18th Amendment, left out the legalization of homebrewing. Now, the idea was that you could make wine now legally, but if you're going to make beer, you had to be taxed on it. Now, it wasn't like they had thugs kicking down doors and knocking down breweries, but the idea was that no one was going to be experimenting on their stovetops if they thought that they would get walloped with a tax bill. So by legalizing homebrewing, people started to experiment again. People who had traveled abroad to England and Germany and Belgium were like, I want to make that beer that I can't get here. And it opened up a whole new world. It opened up a whole new business of the homebrew business. The man that wrote the foreword to my book, Ron Page, was part of that era. And he's now the head brewer at City Steam in Hartford. And he told me about trying to get ingredients from the local health food store, doing anything that he could to try to make beer. This microbrewery revolution in Connecticut was slow to start. The real microbrewery revolution started over in California and slowly made its way east. But when it did hit Connecticut, it hit it pretty hard. New England brewing started out as a brew pub. This is where people were making beer and also having a restaurant, and that was quite a thing. There were chains that would offer freshly brewed beer and a burger all made under the same roof. And what people found is that this is a tough business model to follow, and so a lot would start up and then just as quickly kind of fade away. Troutbrook Brewing was an important brewery in Hartford that would later become Thomas Hooker Brewing in Bloomfield, when they would take a couple of their most popular beer, Troutbrook Ale, and launch their own brewery there. Farmington River Brewing in Bloomfield lasted for a while, as did John Harvard's and Hartford Brewing. Kind of came and went. But Control Brewing, out in Pawcatuck, for 13 years made Old Yankee Ale, the only kind, the only beer. They're still around, and now experimenting with IPAs or India Pale Ales. City Steam Brewing Cafe has now blossomed into this destination for beer lovers and bachelorette parties because they've got this great comedy club downstairs. But they've also got some wonderful beer. Around 2000, we started kind of, the people who were going to survive were really rising to the top. Southport Brewing at one point had 4 or 5, at its peak, had 5 different locations. And now they have 2. Willimantic Brewing is one of the greatest brew pubs you're going to go to in the whole country. And if it weren't all the way out in Willimantic, I'd go more often. But I had a blast going there. And what they've done, which is important in modern Connecticut beer history, is that they established early on that there was going to be a charity arm related to them in one way or another. So all the time they're going to have proceeds of pints going to one charity or another. And so I don't know of any brewery in Connecticut that doesn't have some element to them where they raise money for a good cause. And I think that's pretty wonderful. Old Burnside started out in East Haven as an ice maker. They were known back in the day when you went to go pick up your ice as having some great water that homebrewers were making their beer with. They said what's wonderful is that it replicates the water that you would get in parts of England. Now, these guys aren't dumb. They're like, let's get in on that. And so they started their own brewery. Cambridge House Brewing's an important one. They're in Granby. They're another one that held on to that brew pub model. They tried to expand into Torrington, but that didn't work out. But on the good side, we ended up inheriting a fantastic beer bar called Backstage. It's another thing that I do in the book is I talk about I do a profile of every brewery in the state, but I also talk about some important beer bars. I'm happy with the photography in the book. All the best photography was not taken by me, although I was happy with the one on the left. That's Jen Muckerman and her dog, Barnaby. she's one of the only female brewers in the state, and she is with Half Full Brewing in lovely Stamford. We've got Relic Brewing in Plainville that's known as a nano brewery. They're so small. But what's so great about little tiny breweries like this is you can go 1 week and they'll have a whole lineup of beers. 2 weeks later, they'll have a whole bunch of new ones because they can turn it over that quickly. They don't have a lot of storage. They have to. So I had a blast doing the responsible thing, which was to go to all the breweries in person. It was important to me to do that, but also I like to think that I got some good pictures in there as well. You can't talk about the history of modern Connecticut without talking about Two Roads Brewing. Two Roads is big, and that's what really sets them apart. They make wonderful beer, and another element is that they actually make beer for other people, which is called contract brewing. Other breweries will bring their recipes to them, and sometimes their staff, and make beer on their premises. So breweries from all over the country. So it's a really, they play a really important role, and it's actually, they have a fantastic tasting room as well. This is my favorite tasting room. This is in Bristol, and it is not a place that you think there's going to be anything, much less a cool little brewery. When you go, you're kind of driving into a warehouse situation in an industrial park that looks like time forgot it. But when you get inside, you get this great feeling of togetherness, of warmth, and there are no TVs, which is pretty cool. I talk about some other breweries here. Broadbrook Brewing, classic story of 3 home brewers who just wanted to go pro. So they found an industrial space, a little area right next to a Chinese food place, and just are making their dreams come true. And that's what I love doing about interviewing. You get to see these people who are certainly risking a lot, and they're certainly not on easy street, but they're seeing their dreams come true, and that's pretty great. As 2012 came along, you see another big boom in brewing because breweries are now allowed to sell pints right from their breweries. So now they're tasting rooms where they used to just give you shot glasses full of beer. You can just kind of belly up to the bar. And I think that's what's great about that is kind of bringing the tavern element back so that we go full circle. We've got some great stories from Duvig. Duvig are 2 families, 2 husband and wife teams that get snowed in during a blizzard in 2013. They both discovered they're both home brewers, and they said, hey, let's make a brewery. And they did. It's never that easy, and I know there were a lot of stops along the way, but that's a great genesis story. And I was happy and privileged enough to be able to hear about those. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a brewery whose owner is from the New Canaan area. And that's Charter Oak Brewing Company, which was also founded in 2012. And Scott will be able to tell you a lot more about his brewery, and you should definitely check out his beers. But here's someone who went from a completely different background, a background in paper, and was able to follow his dreams and follow his skills. And that is how he's put himself on the map. Another thing about Charter Oak Brewing is that no one is nicer or works harder to get his beer into your mouth. This guy is out all the time. And I don't know if there's 3 of them or what, but one of them's here tonight, so we are very lucky. And just to finish up the modern list, this is Tyler Jones. He's a brewery, Black Hog Brewing in Oxford. He came from New Hampshire. Steady Habit in East Haddam has opened up recently, and Voracious in Monroe just opened up in March. So it's been quite a ride. We've got Outer Light Brewing that's opened up even more recently than that in Groton. So it's getting to a point where people are starting to ask, are we getting too big? Are there too many breweries? Can Connecticut handle more? And I would say yes. I think that until we're about 20 minutes away from a brewery, we're certainly going to be able to handle more. That's about as long as I want to drive to get to a brewery. Here's my pitch to you. There might be someone out there that wants to start a brewery, and I say that's a good idea. More importantly, I want you to start a brewery in Litchfield County. We are starving for one. We have one in Kent that does not allow people to go into it yet because it does not have that license yet. But I mean, come on, people. We are thirsty. We are just as good as anyone else in Litchfield County. We pay our taxes. We do our best to be good citizens. Why? Why? Anyway, I'll let you ponder that. So I want to leave you with a quote, and then I want to take some questions that I can answer. I am a middle school teacher, and I am used to getting questions that I can't answer all the time. It would be a relief if I could answer one tonight. But we'll just take that as it comes. I asked Jeff Browning, like I asked all the brewers that I profiled, a question, and his question was, what can today's brewers in Connecticut learn from the Connecticut brewers of the past? He said, you need to be true to what you do best and not worry about what everyone else is brewing. Beer is not going anywhere. Remember, fads are fads, so brew what you are passionate about and prove to everyone else it's worth having around. Let the big breweries sell mass market appeal beer. Every wave must hit the shore, and when this wave ends, it will be the talented, well-financed breweries that will be around for the next 10 or 15 years. I hope I'm around for the next 10 or 15 years writing about beer, and I'm pretty sure it'll be a slightly different picture. And it's an amazing world out there, even if you are a little bit curious about beer and brewing in Connecticut. I definitely say go out, find out, check out these places for yourselves. I thank you very much for your time. Can I try to answer your questions? You, sir.
Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
I've heard the number 40 as the number of breweries in our state. Is that about right?
I'd say about 31 or 32. I haven't checked my Facebook in a while because they are opening up all the time. The idea is that there are certainly 40 ready to go, and if you get into the beer geek circle and you start following all these breweries on Twitter, you would be forgiven for thinking there are more because a lot of them are going to brew festivals with their beer and they're marketing as if they're open, but they aren't yet. They just need to get the licensing. And this is going to be a subject of a future column is, how do you get from idea to opening up? There are a lot of hoops to go through, and there's a lot of money to pay. But they're doing it smarter now, and I think that they're taking fewer ridiculous risks and taking smarter risks now. So that I wouldn't doubt that we'd be at 40 within the end of next year.
Could you give me a criticism of draft or tap beer versus bottled beer?
Sure.
And how the craft beer industry fits into that?
It's a very good question. How is craft draft beer or any draft beer different than beer right out of the bottle or the can, right? It really is a genuine distinct taste that you might have, but having beer on draft has a lot of positives. One is that chances are it's been held at the right temperature and it's been away from any light spoilage for any period of time. But there are dangers. There are dangers of lines that are not cleaned well. And of course, the very evil getting your beer poured into a glass that's been in a freezer. Nobody does that, right? Because if you learn anything, that's a beer snob thing. Say, I like my glass room temperature. Because if it goes into that cold glass, that's taking away a lot of the taste. What I've found with craft beer, especially, is that dirty lines are becoming less and less of a problem because there's so much more turnover and people are known, they know more about how to clean their lines. Now, there are a lot of advantages to having beer in bottles or cans. Cans especially are becoming much more popular now because, one, they are lighter and therefore cheaper to transport. And I think that that plays a big role. They're easier to stack. And they also block from light, which is what skunks a beer almost more than anything else, even temperature fluctuation. You want that light to be away. That's why beers in brown bottles are going to hold up better than beers in green or, God forbid, clear bottles. God, I got really snobby there for a second. I apologize. But that's my thing, I guess. So does that answer your question? I think what craft beer specifically is doing is forcing bars to have more diversity, and therefore I think what they're doing is they're turning over their lines better.
Well, I hear myself and other people remarking upon stale beer, when, particularly from draft. If you go to pick a brand that's not used that often, you begin to wonder whether, hey, this is pretty stale stuff.
Yeah.
What do you think about lifetime for a beer?
Lifetime for a beer, I would say depending on the type of beer. Now, for example, if it has a lot of alcohol in it, it can actually age really well in a cellar temperature. But for the most part, you really don't want to have a beer that's much more than 6 months old. And there are certain beers like IPAs, India Pale Ales, that have a lot of delicate, fragile hops in it that you want to have within a month. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Does anybody have any other thoughts on that?
I was wondering if you do an overview of two rows. I kind of like your double IPA. I know a lot of money's been invested, but there's some variability in quality of flavor.
Yeah, and I would say that I don't drink their one product often enough to be able to give a real unbiased view of it. Because it's an occupational hazard. I gotta try them all. But I do know what you mean. From what I know, their brewery staff has remained fairly consistent. There's going to be times when a beer year over year is going to taste differently. It could happen for a couple of reasons. One is they might have a different water source. They might treat their water differently time over time. But I would think a crew like Two Roads would try to keep the variables down as little as possible unless they're going to do a new release of it. The other thing would be if they just have to have different hops because for whatever reason their contracts with hops either ran out or the quality just wasn't as good. So that would be, I think, the only reason. The other might be age. So you want to check the bottles to see when it was brewed, and that might not be the brewery's fault. It might just gotten through the cracks in the package store. Had been holding on for too long. But I hear that a lot about beers, especially the IPAs, India Pale Ales, because they are using such delicate ingredients that year over year there could be a change in the way that they taste. And so, I don't know, I'm a malt head. Malt heads are ones that go for the soupy, thick, sweeter beers. So I'm not afraid to say, that I love the Lights Out Stout, for example, from Charter Oak. And I love the porter from back east. It's probably my favorite beer of the state. And it's not a beer that people think about when they think about craft beer because they always want more bitter. Let's get it as bitter as possible. I'm not that guy. Sir?
Is there a marketing association of Connecticut breweries? For example, there's a wine trail, there's a museum trail. Is there a beer trail?
There is, but it's purely virtual. Right now, if you went to ctbeertrail.net, what you'll find is a beer trail of sorts that links to all the brewers. The Connecticut Brewers Association meets about once a month or so at a different brewery, and they talk about ways to work on marketing. The big difference between wine beer trail and the wine trail and the beer trail is the wine trail has the signage, and signage is expensive. And so from what I can gather, that is not as top of a priority for the brewers. They really want to create a buzz in the media. They want to influence people like me. They want to influence people like you in order to say, hey, let's organize a bus tour, for example, which is something that CT Beer Trail does. So you could get on a bus in Hartford and head north and hit 4 breweries in a day, plus a restaurant, and that kind of thing. So that I've seen more and more of that happening. So yes, and you can see them and at ctbeertrail.net for some reason. Sir?
You mentioned the right temperature for beer. What, in your opinion, is the ideal temperature to drink beer, and is it different for ale?
Good question. Yes, I personally like my ales a little bit warmer than my lagers. So I would say you want it cool, not warm, and not cold. So I would put it somewhere around. I've never actually put a temperature gauge in there, thermometer, but I would hazard to guess around 50 degrees, maybe a little less for an ale. Maybe 45, and that's a little warm for most people. But certainly not room temperature. That would be it would not taste as good. But lagers, for me, you want to have cold. You don't want to have them ice cold unless you don't like that beer. Then by all means drink it as ice cold as you can. But the reason why, yeah.
I was driving on Route 7 in Newton a couple of days ago, and there was an ad up near where the Walmart is, serving ice cold beer, the coldest beer anywhere. I was horrified.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good marketing. It's like health beer. You know, the idea is that have our ice cold beer. It's cold as the Rockies water. You're gonna freeze your lungs off. You're gonna, well, why? What are you trying to hide? You know, and so yeah, beer snobs will be like, no, I don't want my glass, frosted, and because the idea is that a little bit of warmth releases a lot of flavor. A lot of people say that a good beer, especially if it has a lot of ingredients, or really what they call a high grain bill, where you're dealing with lots of different malts and you're dealing with a lot of different hops, that actually tells a story. And so the idea is that first sip is going to taste slightly different than the last sip, but the idea is hopefully keep on sipping as opposed to chugging. Yeah. Sir, in the blazer.
Other than the water, can you speak to what ingredients are locally grown, if any, and how that's changed over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. Which ingredients are available locally? Not many, and it hasn't really changed since the modern era. We tend to get, the breweries tend to get their material from out of state unless it's a specialty ingredient. So for example, the elements of beer are water, a fermented grain, usually barley, and so we don't have barley fields here in Connecticut, but you could also include wheat or spelt or anything else that you can get those sugars from. So that category tends to be off the table locally. Hops are the third ingredient, and that's what brings the bitterness to the beer, and it also brings the aroma to the beer. Now, when you put certain types of hops very late in the process, that's where you get the aroma. And what I'm finding more and more is that local brewers are using aroma hops that are, if not directly local in their backyard, somewhere in Connecticut. Black Hog recently did a trip to New Jersey to get hops there. So what you need really is a lot of space. You need a lot of space. Kent Falls Brewing in Kent is doing what they can to try to use as many ingredients as possible to make their beer, but they're on a farm, and they've got 50 vines, up in the air where they're going to get tons of hops, but they're not going to be able to compete with any larger brewer. And then there's yeast, which usually comes from a lab, and so that's often taken down. But with yeast, if you are going to be spontaneously fermenting beer, if you're going to be leaving it out and letting the elements come in, well, that's about as local as it can get. And so if you're talking about, I recognize that bacteria, yeah. So that's pretty local. But, the concept of Connecticut beer, that's where it's made. A lot of the ingredients are from elsewhere. So there is a movement to get more hops into Connecticut. We have a climate for it, but the thing is we got to have space for it. And it is not the kind of crop that you can be sure of. It's certainly not a sure thing. And I think I'm coming to the very edge of my knowledge on this, so I'm going to stop talking. I'm about to say something I'm not sure about.
Can you talk about the licenses and legal stuff and the hoops that you have to jump through?
Well, I'm certain that Scott will be able to answer this better than I can. But from what I can tell, you really are you have to deal with a number of people on a certain number of levels when you're trying to build a brewery. And so you've certainly got to talk to planning and zoning if you're going to be establishing your business in any kind of area that isn't in your own house. But you've got to go outside of the house, so that means you're going to probably end up using utilities, and so you're going to have to deal with them. But licensing comes from federal and state, so you're going to have to get the tobacco and alcohol divisions. They're going to have to give you licenses. And also you have to pass health codes, and a lot of times you're going to need to pass fire codes. And then there's, if you want to bottle your beer, you've got to go through a whole bunch of licenses there. There are licenses that you have to get to serve beer, so your insurance has to be just right. So, you know, there are a lot of hoops, but I've seen breweries. There's one called, I didn't even have a chance to put it up here. It's just appeared, called Cold Creek Brewing in Ellington. I was like, where'd you guys come from? You know, because, I mean, they must have been working hard underground, but the idea is it does take a long time. And so those are some of the major ones. I've gone to planning and zoning meetings where they take public comment, and that's got to be some of the most frustrating things for the brewers, especially if, you know, the people nearby are not in my backyard, you know, that kind of attitude. And I totally understand that, but it is hard to start a brewery unless it's going to be in an industrial space. And some people want to go beyond that. I think that's the future of Connecticut brewing is it's not just a beer, it's got to be an experience. So you go there and you want to feel like I can be nowhere else but here to have this experience. You know, Stony Creek has done this with a lot of money. Again, it's not, you know, it's not something that anybody can do, but the idea is that they're creating a space for that experience. And yeah, that takes a lot of patience, connections, and time. Yeah. Bless you. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Regarding the temperature, the British like their, or the English,
Mm-hmm.
like their beer warm.
Mm.
And we like it cold.
Mm.
Same beer.
Yeah, and certain beer
It's a matter of
just,
culture.
it is. And I think that you're going to find that with food as well. I think that we are not as used to having beer with every meal. Well, certainly my school frowns upon it. Whereas in other countries, it's really no big deal to have beer every day with any meal that you can get away with it. So yeah, it is about culture, and it's about, you know, acceptance of that. I'd like to take one more question, and then I think I'm thirsty. I don't know about you guys, and I would, you know, really love it if you would consider purchasing my book as well. It's a good read. I'm proud of it. Yes, sir. Oh, were you? No, anybody else? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, could you compare Connecticut's growth in the microbrewery and brew pub sphere relative to the other New England states?
We're a little late to the game. I think that Maine, despite the fact that they, you know, were so good at stamping it down, they were also very good at releasing it. So Maine and Vermont were definitely ahead of us. Massachusetts, with Boston Beer Company, you know, played such an important role. But even Western Massachusetts played an important role. New Hampshire was ahead of us. So really, Connecticut was late to the game. And I think that, you know, when I read the Maine book that's from the History Press, you know, they actually had breweries that, like Gritty McDuff's, for example, that had been around since the mid-'80s, whereas we really don't have anything like that. And that's just one of like 3 or 4, you know, that have been around. But in the grand scheme of things, you know, that wave came over in the early 80s and, you know, blossomed in, you know, in the early 90s. So, you know, it wasn't as if we were a demilitarized zone where there was no beer. It just certainly wasn't catching fire. I think part of that is we're a wine state. I mean, I think that tends to be where our loyalty lies. We have some amazing vineyards, not like they were trying to put anybody down, but I think that, you know, it becomes a cultural thing. So that's my short answer on that one. All right, well, thank you so much. I'd be happy to answer more questions by the books. Thank you.